They tore down my ice house while I was standing on a glacier in Iceland. That is not a metaphor. I was literally roped to a guide, crampons biting into blue ice, wind cutting across my face. When back home on my own lakefront property in upstate New York, a demolition crew was turning 170 years of history into a pile of stone and dust. And the worst part is, they thought they were doing me a favor. My name is Daniel Mercer. I own 21 acres of lakefront land on the eastern shore of Lake Alder, about 40 minutes outside Albany. It has been in my family since 1884, when my great-great-grandfather worked the railroad line that used to run straight through our county. Before refrigeration, before grocery stores had freezers humming in every aisle, this region ran on lake ice. And my family's stone ice house was part of that story. When I say ice house, I do not mean a shed with a rusty lock and a sagging roof. I mean a 20-foot tall stone structure with double insulated walls packed with sawdust, hand-cut blocks, original timber beams still bearing the marks of 19th century tools. That building supplied ice to the entire valley before electricity changed everything. It survived 2 world wars, a hurricane in the 1930s, and decades of neglect before I restored it. I moved back to the property in 2012 after my dad passed. I had been working as an environmental researcher, studying glacial melt patterns, which is ironic now that I think about it. While I was tracking the slow disappearance of ancient ice overseas, the last physical reminder of my family's ice trade was being erased at home. When I returned to Lake Alder full-time, the ice house was in rough shape, but structurally sound. I poured 5 years into restoring it. I worked with a local preservation architect, Martha Klein, who had a soft spot for railroad-era structures. We documented everything. We registered it with the County Historic Preservation Board. We had it surveyed professionally. The boundary lines were crystal clear. The entire footprint of that ice house sat well within my property line, a good 30 feet from the nearest edge. For years, nobody questioned it. The neighbors would bring their kids over for school tours. I would open the big wooden doors and explain how they packed ice blocks and layers of straw. It was not some tourist trap. It was part of the community's story. Then, 3 summers ago, the Harringtons moved in next door. Their names were Colin and Rebecca Harrington. They came up from Manhattan after selling a tech company, bought the biggest lakefront mansion on our side of Alder, and immediately started talking about modernizing the shoreline. You know the type. Outdoor kitchen, infinity dock, glass railings, everything white and minimal. The first time I met Colin, I was giving a small tour to a local homeschool group. He walked up in loafers that had probably never touched mud, sunglasses on, smiling like he was running for office. He said, "Hey neighbor, beautiful property you've got here." I said, "Thanks. Been in the family a long time." He nodded at the ice house. "That old thing yours?" I smiled. "Yeah, built in the 1850s. Railroad era. It used to supply ice to most of the valley." He gave me that polite half-smile people use when they are pretending to be impressed. Wow, that's rustic. Rustic. That word stuck with me. Over the next few weeks, I noticed survey stakes popping up near the property line. I did not think much of it at first. Big renovation projects need measurements. But then one afternoon, Rebecca came over while I was trimming back brush. She said, "We're working with a shoreline design firm out of Boston. They're helping us maximize lake views. Your stone building kind of blocks the sight line from our upper deck." I laughed, because I genuinely thought she was joking. The ice house was entirely on my land. I said, "Well, good thing it's not on yours." She did not laugh. She said, It feels like it's right there on the edge. Almost shared space, you know?" I didn't know. I knew exactly what she was doing. Floating the idea that something long established was suddenly negotiable. I went inside that night and pulled out my survey documents. I checked the landmark registry. Everything was clean. Clear boundaries. Official recognition as a protected historic structure. 2 weeks later, I flew to Iceland for a research collaboration. 10 days on the ice, limited signal, mostly focused on data collection. I remember standing there one morning, staring at this massive wall of blue ice, thinking about impermanence, how landscapes change over centuries. What I did not know was that back home, change was happening with a hydraulic excavator. When I landed in Newark and turned my phone off airplane mode, I had 6 missed calls from my neighbor across the road, an older guy named Frank Donnelly. Frank has lived on Alder longer than anyone. He is the unofficial historian of the lake. His last voicemail was tight, controlled. "Danny, You need to call me. It's about the ice house. My stomach dropped before he even said the rest. By the time I pulled into my gravel driveway that evening, the sun was setting behind the water, casting that golden light across the shore. For a split second, everything looked normal. Then I saw the gap. Where the stone structure had stood for a century and a half, there was open sky. Just rubble, broken beams, shattered stone, a flattened rectangle of disturbed earth. I parked and just sat there, hands still on the steering wheel. It felt like someone had punched me in the chest. Frank walked over slowly from across the road. He did not say I'm sorry. He just said, they brought in a crew 3 days ago. Said they had authorization. Authorization from who? I asked. He shook his head. From the Harringtons. I walked down toward the shoreline. The original timber beams were splintered. The antique ice tongs my grandfather used to show me were twisted under a pile of debris. The double stone walls, packed with old insulation material, had been ripped apart like cardboard. 17 decades of history, gone in less than 48 hours. I remember whispering, "No, no, no, no." Frank said, I tried to stop them. Told them that building was registered. They said it was unsafe and encroaching. Encroaching. On my own land. I pulled out my phone and called Colin Harrington. He answered on the second ring. Casual, as if we were discussing lawn care. "Hey Daniel, you tore down my ice house." There was a pause. Not shocked. Not confused. Just a measured pause. "Oh, that old structure. Yeah, we had it removed." Removed. I said, that building was on my property. It's a registered historic landmark. He exhaled, almost amused. "Daniel, it was crumbling. Our shoreline consultant flagged it as a liability. We assumed it was some shared boundary situation. We cleaned it up. Honestly, the waterfront looks much better now." I felt something shift inside me right then. Not just anger. Something colder. "You assumed," I said slowly, "that you could demolish a 170-year-old building on land you do not own." He said, "If you think there's an issue, have your lawyer call mine." And then he hung up. That was the moment this stopped being about a building. It became about something else entirely. I stood there for a long time after Colin hung up, staring at that empty space where the ice house had stood, and I remember thinking how strange it was that grief and anger can sit in your chest at the same time without canceling each other out. I was grieving the building, the history, my grandfather's stories, and at the exact same time I was furious in a way I had not felt since I was a kid getting shoved around in middle school. That night I did not sleep. I went through old photos on my laptop, pictures from the restoration, close-ups of the original stonework, shots of local kids standing inside during field trips, Martha Klein smiling with a clipboard in her hand. Around 3 in the morning, I opened the County Preservation Registry website and stared at the listing again, making sure it had not magically disappeared. It was still there. Mercer Ice House, circa 1850s. Protected structure. Verified survey on file. By 8 a.m., I was sitting in the office of my attorney, a guy named Thomas Caldwell. Tom is not flashy. He wears the same navy suit to everything and has a habit of tapping his pen against his legal pad when he is thinking. He has handled property issues for my family before, minor boundary disputes, nothing like this. I laid everything out. The registry, the survey, photos before demolition, photos after, Frank's statement, the voicemail timestamps. Tom leaned back slowly in his chair and said, "They did not just cross a line, Daniel. They bulldozed over it. Can we make them rebuild it?" I asked. He shook his head. "You cannot rebuild 170 years. But you can seek damages. Significant ones. And because it was protected, this is not just civil trespass. This could trigger preservation penalties." I told him about the phone call. The tone. The assumption. Tom's jaw tightened slightly. He said, "All right. Then we do this clean. We send a formal demand letter first. Give them the opportunity to correct it before we go nuclear." The number we came up with after consulting a historical reconstruction specialist was $890,000. That was what it would cost to reconstruct the ice house authentically, using period-appropriate materials, stone masonry, insulation replication, structural engineering, and preservation oversight. And even then, it would be a replica, not the original. Tom drafted the letter. 10 days to respond. Payment in full to fund reconstruction, plus acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Otherwise, we file suit for full landmark violation, trespass, and punitive damages. The letter went out certified mail. For a few days, there was silence. The lake was quiet too, like it was holding its breath. Then, on the 9th day, Tom received a response from a Manhattan firm representing the Harringtons. The letter was cold, clinical. It claimed the structure was unsafe, posed environmental hazards, and that the Harringtons acted in good faith under the belief it encroached on a shared boundary. As a gesture of goodwill, they were willing to offer $45,000 for the installation of a historical marker plaque commemorating the former structure. $45,000. For a plaque. I actually laughed when Tom read that part out loud. Not because it was funny, but because the audacity was almost impressive. They are trying to minimize exposure, Tom said calmly. If they frame it as an unsafe shed, not a landmark, the damages shrink. Unsafe shed. I thought about the 5 years of documented restoration, the structural reports, the school tours, the preservation board sign-off. I said file it. So he did. The lawsuit hit the county court within 48 hours. Trespass. Destruction of protected historic property. Request for full reconstruction damages, legal fees, and landmark violation penalties. We also requested injunctive relief preventing any development on the demolished footprint until the matter was resolved. That last part turned out to be critical, because about 2 weeks after we filed, I noticed construction materials being delivered to the Harrington property. Lumber, metal framing, dock components. I walked down toward the shoreline and saw survey tapes stretched across the exact spot where my ice house had stood. They were building a lakeside entertainment cabana, practically on top of the ruins. I walked over and found Colin standing there with a contractor, gesturing toward the water. You cannot build there, I said evenly. That is still under dispute. He looked at me like I was being dramatic. Our attorney advised us we're within our rights. The structure was removed. The view is open. We're improving the shoreline. Improving for who? For the neighborhood, he said with a thin smile. There it was again. That word. Neighborhood. As if he had appointed himself chairman of Lake Alder Aesthetics. You destroyed a registered landmark, I said. And now you are building over it like it never existed. He shrugged. Daniel, nostalgia does not override progress. That sentence lit something in me I cannot fully explain. It was not just about my family anymore. It was about the idea that history was disposable if it did not match someone's design palette. Tom filed an emergency motion when he heard about the cabana. The judge scheduled a preliminary hearing 6 weeks out. In the meantime, construction continued. The cabana rose fast. Steel posts anchored into the shoreline. A bar frame. Wiring for outdoor lighting. It was sleek and modern, and everything the ice house was not. The community started talking. Some neighbors sided quietly with me. Others said under their breath that maybe the lake did look cleaner now. I learned quickly that preservation is popular until it interferes with property values. Frank stopped by one evening with a 6-pack and said, "They think you'll settle." I said, "I will not." He nodded. Good. The day of the hearing arrived gray and humid. The courtroom was small, wood-paneled, smelling faintly of old paper. Judge Eleanor Whitaker presided. Mid-60s. Sharp eyes. No nonsense. Tom laid out the evidence methodically. Certified survey. Preservation registry documentation. Photographs. Expert statements on reconstruction costs. Frank's testimony about the demolition crew. The Harringtons' attorney argued encroachment ambiguity, safety concerns, aesthetic impact. He used phrases like reasonable assumption and good faith remediation. Then the judge asked a single question that changed the temperature of the room. Counsel, did your clients obtain written authorization from the property owner before demolition? Silence. No, Your Honor. Did they verify the boundary through an independent survey before engaging heavy equipment? Another pause. No, Your Honor. Judge Whitaker removed her glasses and set them on the bench. Good faith requires due diligence, she said. I see none here. She granted a temporary injunction halting further construction on the disputed footprint and scheduled a full evidentiary hearing for damages. Outside the courthouse, Colin caught up to me in the parking lot. You're making this bigger than it needs to be, he said, low and tight. You made it big when you brought in excavators, I replied. He stepped closer. Do you really think dragging this out is good for anyone? We could have written a check and moved on. You offered $45,000 for a plaque. He smiled without humor. It's just a building. I looked him dead in the eye and said no. It was a boundary. From that moment on, it stopped being neighborly tension and became open war, just the quiet, legal kind fought with filings instead of fists. The full evidentiary hearing was scheduled about 3 months later, and in that stretch of time something inside me settled. Not calmed down exactly, but sharpened. The first few weeks after the demolition, I had been reacting out of hurt. By the time we walked into that courtroom again, I was operating on principle. The cabana construction had technically been halted on the exact footprint of the old ice house, but the Harringtons kept building right up to the edge of the injunction line. It was almost theatrical. Steel beams, polished concrete, a lakeside bar with recessed lighting. From my porch, I could see the frame of it rising where my grandfather once stood stacking blocks of winter ice. Every evening, I would walk down to the cleared patch of earth that used to hold the ice house foundation. I left a few stones in place deliberately, like a scar that refused to fade. Sometimes I would just stand there, hands in my pockets, replaying the sound of Colin's voice saying, "It's just a building." I realized that what bothered me most was not the loss. It was the assumption, the idea that money and momentum could override memory. That if you move fast enough and confidently enough, people will question themselves instead of you. The morning of the final hearing was crisp and bright, the kind of early fall day that makes the lake look like polished glass. Tom met me on the courthouse steps with a thin folder under his arm. "You ready?" he asked. "As I'll ever be." Inside, Judge Whitaker listened to 2 full days of testimony. Preservation experts testified about the ice house's historical significance. A structural engineer confirmed it had been stable prior to demolition. The county preservation chairperson explained the protected status in clear, unambiguous language. Then came the financials. The reconstruction estimate held firm at $890,000. On top of that, statutory penalties for unauthorized demolition of a registered landmark. Legal fees. Court costs. The Harringtons' legal team tried one last pivot. They argued that because the structure no longer existed, equivalent compensation could be calculated differently, perhaps as diminished property value instead of full reconstruction. Judge Whitaker did not look impressed. On the second afternoon, she read her ruling from the bench. The evidence demonstrates that the plaintiff's historic structure stood entirely within surveyed property boundaries. The defendants failed to conduct due diligence prior to demolition and proceeded without consent. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff. She paused just long enough for the weight of that to land. Damages are awarded in the amount of $890,000 for reconstruction, plus preservation penalties and legal fees to be determined. Furthermore, the court authorizes equitable relief to ensure compliance. Equitable relief. Tom had explained that phrase to me earlier. It meant the court had flexibility beyond a simple check. Judge Whitaker continued, given that defendants initiated construction on the disputed footprint subsequent to demolition and prior to full adjudication, the court authorizes the removal of any structures encroaching upon or benefiting from the unlawfully cleared area at the defendant's expense. The room went very quiet. Colin's jaw tightened. Rebecca stared straight ahead. It took me a second to process what she had just said. Removal of any structures benefiting from the unlawfully cleared area. That sleek, modern lakeside cabana had been positioned precisely to capitalize on the improved sightline created by the destruction of my ice house. Without that cleared space, its layout made no sense. Its foundation cut into the same shoreline grading that had been altered during demolition. Outside the courthouse, reporters were not waiting. This was not national news. It was a small county case about a stone building by a lake. But for me, it felt seismic. Colin approached me again, though this time there was no casual tone. "This is insane," he said under his breath. "You're going to tear down our cabana over this?" I did not raise my voice. I said, "You tore down my history." He shook his head. "We can appeal. You can try." Over the next few weeks, their legal team did file motions to stay enforcement pending appeal. Judge Whitaker denied them. The language in her order was clear. Immediate compliance. And so one gray morning in late October, I stood once again on the shoreline of Lake Alder watching a demolition crew unload equipment. This time, they were not strangers hired by someone else. They were there under court order. There was paperwork. There were permits. There was a sheriff's deputy present to ensure no one interfered. Colin and Rebecca were there too. Not yelling, not posturing, just standing stiffly near the edge of their property as the first hydraulic arm swung toward the cabana's steel frame. I will not pretend I felt nothing. There was satisfaction. Of course there was. When the first support beam buckled and the structure groaned, part of me thought, now you understand. But there was also something heavier. Because watching any structure fall, even one I resented, is not joyful. It is final. The demolition took 2 days. The lakeside bar came down in sections. The polished concrete slab was broken apart and hauled off. The shoreline was regraded under supervision to restore the contour that had existed before the original demolition. At one point, Colin walked over while I was standing near the water. He said, "Was it worth it?" I thought about that. About the months of stress. The legal bills, even though they would be reimbursed. The tension on the lake. The neighbors whispering. I said, it wasn't about winning. He let out a short laugh. Sure it wasn't. I looked out across the water and said, you thought because you could afford something, you were entitled to it. That's not how this works. Not here. For the first time since I met him, he did not have a comeback. By early November, the cabana was gone. The shoreline was quiet again. Just open space and the lake stretching out beyond it. A few weeks later, the Harrington's appeal was quietly withdrawn. They paid the judgment in full. $890,000 for reconstruction, plus $276,000 in penalties and legal fees. I have not rebuilt the ice house yet. That surprises people when they hear the story. They expect me to say I broke ground immediately, laid the first stone with triumphant music playing in the background. But here's the truth. You cannot recreate 170 years. You can build a replica, yes. And I likely will, in time, working again with preservation experts, documenting every step. But I am not rushing it. Right now, the foundation stones that survived sit in a neat stack near the shoreline. I visit them sometimes. I run my hand over the rough surface and think about my grandfather, about blocks of ice hauled in the dead of winter, about how communities used to depend on one another instead of consultants and sightline studies. Colin and Rebecca still live next door. We nod when we pass. It is civil, quiet. There is no friendship there, but there is an understanding now. The lake looks different without the ice house. I will admit that. More open. Cleaner, some would say. But every time I see that stretch of empty sky, I remember what it cost to keep it from becoming a precedent. Because that is what this really was. Not a fight over stone and timber. A line in the sand about boundaries, about respect, about whether history is an inconvenience or a responsibility. Some neighbors still think I overreacted. They say I could have taken the $45,000 and put up a plaque, avoided months of drama. Others say I should have demanded even more. So I want to ask you something. If someone bulldozed a piece of your family's history because it did not fit their aesthetic, what would you have done? Would you have settled? Would you have let it go for the sake of peace? Or would you have fought, knowing it would get ugly? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely want to know where you land on this. And if you believe boundaries still matter, that history is not disposable just because someone wealthier moves in next door, hit like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes justice is not loud. Sometimes it is just standing on your own shoreline, knowing the line is still yours.